Hi friends, welcome to our next set of notes. Make sure that you have your notes outlined open. It's for a divided nation, and I'm going to be going through these today and talking a little bit about all of the events leading up to the Civil War. So these notes might be a little bit longer than normal, but it's because we're talking about a war starting. And right, we know that it doesn't just cause, like, wars aren't started by like one single event usually. There's usually a buildup that's been happening. It could be over months, over years, and then maybe like one event is like the last straw, but it's not just one single thing. It's usually a complex series of like growing frustration or different things like that, right? So like, for example, think back to when we learned about the American Revolution. It wasn't like the British passed a tea tax and then we're like, we're going to war with the British. Some people probably said that, but the majority of people, it wasn't like that, right? It was a series of events. There's a series of taxes, right? Think Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, intolerable acts. Think about the Continental Congress meeting, the battles at Lexington and Concord, all of these different components, all this like growing dissatisfaction with the British. It didn't happen overnight. It was over like years, and it was over several events, and it's ultimately going to lead to a war. So same thing that we're getting to here, except with the Civil War. So what we're going to do is, we've already been talking about this growing frustration over slavery, right? The South is like holding on to this system and they don't want to let it go. And the North is like, okay, it's really bad, but so far there hasn't been huge conflict over it of what we've learned so far in our notes. Obviously, there's people upset about it. Obviously, it's causing tension, but as we see in these notes, there's going to be bigger issues brought up where the slavery question is going to come up more, and it's going to become even more and more important. So I started with this slide first here because here I'll do it in presentation so you can see it a little bit better. But just to kind of show you where we'll be going today or tonight, wherever, whenever you're listening to this, just to kind of see like these are some of the events we're going to talk about, and how right up here it's talking about some of the causes of the conflict, which is going to lead to short-term effects, and ultimately the long-term effect is civil war. But as you see, it's not just one single event that's going to kick off the war. It's a series of events, of feelings, of change in our nation. So, sorry for the long intro, but let's go ahead and get started. I'll go back up to the beginning so you can see where we are, a divided nation. So again, these are our last notes before getting into the Civil War. And so, right, I just think it's fascinating to try and understand, like, how did it get to the point where our country went to war with itself when it was American killing American? How did we get to that point? Like our own people, why are we killing our own people? And so this is the part I love to study and understand is why, how did this happen? And it's not always clear, but these are some key events we can point to and say, this may have been what led to it. So first, here's a little moment for you to try and think way back to our last unit. And if you remember when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, if you don't remember, I know that was a long time ago, but the Missouri Compromise was created as a way to deal with slavery and the slavery issue. I actually talk about in the next slide, so I'll go ahead and go there. We got a little map here first. It was created as a compromise to come up with how are we going to deal with slavery in our new territory, right? We had bought land in the Louisiana Purchase, and so as we're going to be starting to add new states because more people are going to live in this land and they can apply for statehood, are we going to have slaves in these states or not? And the reason why that's a whole big issue is, right, Congress is balanced between different political parties, we know that, but it's also balanced between, back then, people who supported slavery and people who didn't. And if we kept the balance even, everybody is happy. If there's more pro-slavery people, then the government might start passing more pro-slavery laws, and that's going to really upset people that are anti-slavery, and vice versa. So that's why this balance is like so important, and why people are going to be freaking out so much about any sort of imbalance between the number of free states and slave states. So originally the Missouri Compromise just said, okay, any new state above, so north of Missouri's southern border, so right here on the 3630 parallel, any state north, or any new state north would automatically be free. Any state south would automatically be slave state. So that was the compromise back then. It's not going to last forever. In fact, it's about to end right now, and we'll talk about it. Sorry, if I could get to the next slide. There we go. So, as I said, it worked for a little while. However, remember that we go to war with Mexico and we win and we get a bunch of land, right? The Mexican cession. And so now we've got all this new land. Do we continue to have the Missouri Compromise as our way of figuring out which states will have slavery and which states would not? Some people said we should use popular sovereignty. And what that means, popular means think of what's most popular, what does most people want? So that's the way you can remember that word. What do most people want? That's what's popular, right? And so popular sovereignty means political power should belong to the people, and whatever they want, the majority of them, right? The popular, right? Whatever they want, that's what should happen. They should get to vote and decide if they want slavery or not. However, obviously, some state that there should be no slavery whatsoever in this new territory. And a representative to Congress named David Wilmot, he proposed the Wilmot Proviso, and it was a document that stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in any part of the territory. So he was saying in that new territory, that's what we should just say, no slavery here at all. But guess what? It didn't pass in Congress. What a surprise. But great proposition. So overall, it's going to lead to two important issues. As we're thinking about our country expanding, as we're thinking about new states, here's some of the issues. This growing idea of sectionalism. And what that means is the favoring of the interest of one section or region over the interests of the entire country. So what that could mean, it's kind of think with your siblings, if you have siblings, and if one of your parent favors one sibling over the other one. Hopefully your parents don't do that, but my parents and I used to joke about that all the time, and I'd be like, oh, my mom, my sister's your favorite, and right, it'd be frustrating because I feel like she would get stuff that I wanted, and I'd get really upset. So sectionalism is the same thing, except with parts of our country, and so we're maybe the North is getting more favored and they're getting more laws and they're having more laws passed that's going to help their economy. And so the South is really mad. And what about the West? And so this idea is emerging that the areas within our country are very different. The North, the South, and the West are very different. And we're getting upset if one is being favored over the other. And it's dividing us, really, right? I'm a Southerner, I'm a Northerner, instead of saying I'm an American. And thinking of no, we all live here, we have similar interests. Yeah, we have disagreements, but it's people starting to feel they identify more with their region. And that kind of also goes back to the 13 colonies of people really identifying with their colony and eventually their state, and then sort of shifting identity to American. And now we're sort of shifting back towards a region. So that's interesting. We also see the formation of a new political party. It's called the Free Soil Party. And it's made up of anti-slavery Northerners. This party does not exist anymore today, but it came back then as sort of an anti-slavery political party. Okay, so here comes a question. As we know, California is going to have a rapid increase in population. Do you remember why? It's the gold rush. Oh, the gold rush. Thank you. Thank you back there for raising your hand. The gold rush, yes, it brings a bunch of people to California. And so now, all of a sudden, all these decisions about slavery and no slavery are going to come up oh no, right away, because California is going to apply to become a state, and that's going to upset that balance, right? Look, we've got 15 free states, 15 slave states, and California is going to want to enter as a free state. Most people in California didn't really like slavery. So, what do we do now? Well, we return to our buddy Henry Clay, also known as the Great Compromiser. And if you forgot who he was, he's the one who helped propose the Missouri Compromise. And I don't remember if you remember this either, but think back to Andrew Jackson's presidency and the nullification crisis. Remember when South Carolina, they didn't want to pay this tax and they're like, we're just going to leave the country. Henry Clay was the one who proposes like, hey, why don't we just slowly lower the tax over the next couple of years? Let's compromise, let's work together. This is why he's known as the Great Compromiser, because this is what he does. And anyways, so he is going to help settle our crisis of this balance between free states and slave states. So here's what happens. He says California can enter as a free state, and all remaining lands, the rest of the Mexican cession, they can use popular sovereignty to decide on slavery. Texas would give up their land east of the Rio Grande River, and we would pay off any of their debts that they owed to Mexico. And, I'm saying some of the things that are not on here. These are other parts of the compromise. I'm just telling you, but not all of them are here on your notes. Sorry about that. Also, we would end the slave trade in our nation's capital because, talk about ironic in a country, our capital of our country, where all men are created equal and not all men are being treated equal. And there's also a provision about a fugitive slave law, but we'll talk about that a little bit later because it'll make more sense a little bit later. So here's what he's proposing, right? So he said, this is what he was talking about. This other land we got here from the Mexican cession, which now says Utah and New Mexico territory. This is what he's talking about. Let's divide up this land, and once more people live there and want to apply to become a state, those people can vote and just decide if they want slavery or not. It's not automatically decided for them. They could have the choice. I like this one because this is Henry Clay being just like, what do I do? Like, where do you draw the line? Because everything is complicated. Okay. Wait, sorry, I just want to go back and make sure I got everything here. Sorry, I feel like the main thing I forgot to explain here is this compromise he proposes is called the Compromise of 1850. Sorry, should have gotten to that part. So the main thing to get from Compromise of 1850 is California enters as a free state. We divide up the rest of the Mexican cession land into 2 territories and say they get to vote if they want slavery or not. Okay, there we go. Now we can go back to Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, so the Fugitive Slave Act. Basically, this was a new law that was passed that made it a crime to help runaway slaves and allowed officials like police officers or anything like that to arrest slaves living in free areas and bring them back to their owners in the South. White people could testify against accused slaves, but guess what? The slaves themselves could not testify on their behalf. So if they went to court, let's say you're like living in the North, you're like, woo, living my life, you're like a free African American, and some white person sees you and they're like, that person was a slave. And they're like, what? No, I wasn't. And they bring you to court. The white person can be like, oh yeah, I saw them on this plantation and this place and there. And the slave couldn't say anything. They weren't allowed to testify on their own behalf. They could have a white person testify for them, but they couldn't testify at their own trial. So what's crazy about this law, right? So if a slave escapes, people have to go return them. And if you don't, you could be in big trouble. If you know somebody who's a slave that escaped and you don't return them, you yourself could go to jail and be fined $1,000, which in today's dollars, you might be like, that's a lot, but remember, this is a long, long time ago. So that would have been a lot more money than just $1,000. So how do you think people are going to feel about this law? people in the South, right, are probably going to be like, sweet, if our slaves are escaping, this is going to encourage people to bring them back. It's going to scare the slaves from escaping. And people in the North are like, hey, why are you trying to make us involved in your slavery thing here? Like, we don't want to be involved in that. Stop trying to drag us into your problems. So many actually like free African Americans living in the North that were born free, were not slaves, or maybe they bought their freedom, they actually like flee to Canada because they're like, great, I could accidentally, like, someone could just accuse me and I could be brought back to the South, and like, I'm not even from the South, right? So a lot of people will flee to Canada. There's several different court cases that are going to come up of people claiming that they're slaves and other people claiming they're not. Of 343 cases that were reviewed, only 11 found that the person that they claimed was a slave was actually a free person. So what it means is, like, there's all these court cases happening of people accusing, that's a runaway slave, that's runaway slave. And for the most part, people are believing them and sending those people to the South. How many of them actually were slaves that had ran away? Who knows? But as I said in this last bullet point, it's just going to cause Northerners to get even more upset because they feel like they're being dragged into slavery and kind of even being forced to like support it in a way. And so it's great for the abolitionist movement because it's going to make more people want to join this movement, this anti-slavery movement. So here's a little break here. This is a picture from the Fugitive Slave Convention that was held in 1850 in New York. Thousands of people attended, and what they were doing was talking about, what are we going to do with this law? How are we going to still help slaves escape? How are we going to protect our free African Americans living in the North? So I know this picture is a little bit tough to see, like make out all the figures and stuff, but take a look around. Like, what types of people do you see? Are there men? Are there women? African Americans, white people, young, old, right? What do you see here? I would say it's a pretty diverse crowd. I don't know if you even actually might recognize one of these people here. How about this guy right there? Yes, that would be our friend, Frederick Douglass. But it just goes to show, right, that it's not like people are just like, oh yeah, I'm anti-slavery, and they're just living their life. There's a lot of people that are against it and want to try to find ways to stop it. And so this convention is just one example of one convention of what can we do to try to stop this Fugitive Slave Act, and how can we make sure the North or the South is not dragging us into like slavery. Okay, so continue. Ooh, great book here. Okay. Okay, so one way that we know the abolitionist movement worked was through like telling stories, right? We know like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, right? These people who used to be slaves told their stories about what happened, and it reached a great audience. But what's going to be even crazier is the Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a novel. And it's an anti-slavery novel written by this woman here, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she wrote it because she was really against slavery, and she wanted to make it a story that, right, people like to read a story. And quite frankly, she's a white woman, and so people are more like, oh, let's hear what she has to say. So she writes this story after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. It's published in 1852. And again, it's just to educate people about what slavery is really like and reach an even bigger audience. So she kind of based this story off of slaves that she had met. She had met many fugitive slaves who had ran away from the South, and she was shocked by their stories and the way that they were treated and the experiences they had. And she's like, wow, if other people knew this, like maybe there would be a bigger like movement to try and end slavery. So in her book, it's a fictional character, but again, it's based off of these stories that she actually heard. It's about a slave named Tom, and he's taken away from his wife. He's sold to a cruel owner, and eventually his owner beats him to death because he's like in a fit of rage because he's so upset that he beats Tom to death. And Tom is known as like the nicest, like happiest, like just like a sweet man, like a good person. And so people can really identify. They're like, wow, like why? Like why this really good person could be treated this way. And so this story is super popular. People loved it. There were copies sold all around the world. Even the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she wrote a letter to the United States saying, this novel was amazing. Why do you guys still have slavery? What are you going to do about it? You need to get rid of this. This is the Queen of England telling America, hey, you guys need to get rid of slavery. So Southerners just say like, this lady has a crazy imagination, but many in the North believed the story. They are shocked by it, and again, are going to like support the abolitionist cause. Okay, so this is about the election of 1852. This is not in your notes, but it is important in sort of understanding the timeline of our story that we're going along with here. So in the election of 1852, there are 4 candidates running for president that are Democratic candidates. And there was this fear that like none of them would actually get the majority because there's 4 candidates that are running from the Democratic Party. And so this guy, Franklin Pierce, is ultimately going to win because he promises to honor the 1850 Compromise and the Slave Act, and like hoped that this would just sort of like lead to slavery issue be put to rest and be like, okay, let's everybody calm down. I know Northerners are getting upset, Southerners are getting upset. I'm going to continue the Compromise of 1850. We're going to continue with this idea of like people getting to vote if they want slavery or not. So let's all chill. Guess what? People are not going to stay chill. Let's keep going. So this is for sort of a separate act. It's going to be the KansasNebraska Act. There's so many acts and like craziness, you guys. It's all about, I mean, a lot of it's about slavery, but let me just explain this and maybe it'll make a little more sense. Okay, so this guy is a congressman. His name is Stephen Douglas, and he wants to build a railroad across the U.S. that leaves from Chicago. He wanted it to run to the Pacific Ocean, but like land in between it, like Chicago would be kind of like the resting place. But in order to do that, we would need to organize some of the land that we had from the Louisiana Purchase that had still not been like organized into territories yet. It was just sort of like open land. So I kind of mentioned this issue, reminder, in that land, the Missouri Compromise was still in effect. I know this is so confusing. Here's my map. If this makes a little more sense. So we had already talked about over here the Compromise of 1850, how to deal with this land, right? We divided it up and we said, okay, anybody who's moving here and they want to become a state, they can vote yes or no if they want slavery. But we hadn't done anything with this land up here. And I know you're like, why didn't they do something with it? I don't know. They just didn't. So this land is what we're talking about here, is what do we do with this land? Because we want the railroad to run across it, but are we going to have slavery here? Are we not? What are we going to do? So back to here. Southerners say, you know what? Why don't you just build the railroad in the South instead? And we'll only support this if you open up this new land to slavery. So if you want that railroad to be up in the North from Chicago over to the Pacific, that's cool, except that new territory, we want it to be people could have slavery if they want. Obviously, this is controversial. So, in 1854, Douglas proposes the KansasNebraska Act, which would, like I showed you on that little map, divide up those last 2 territories, and people would get to decide on slavery if they wanted it, yes or no. They would get to vote. So, Missouri Compromise is out. Basically, in both of these new, these territories that have all been divided up, everybody can vote if they want slavery or not. Northerners are upset, but regardless, it passes. So now you see both sets of territories can now choose to vote if they want slavery or not. It's up to them. I know, so much work over just a simple thing, but I mean, isn't that how it works sometimes with politics and the government? And everybody has different things and interests and things they're upset about. So it makes sense in that sort of way if you see it that way. Okay, so let's keep on going. So guess what? Kansas now has enough people that they can have a state election to set up a government in the state and to apply for statehood and everything like that. So they're getting ready to have their first votes for their first government in Kansas. And on voting day, so interesting, people in Missouri who were pro-slavery walked across the border to Kansas to vote and then went home. And that's because they wanted the Kansas government to be very pro-slavery, because you want to have a pro-slavery neighbor if you're pro-slavery as well. So going back to the map really quick to give you an idea. So you see Missouri is right here. Kansas was right here, right? And so people literally just walked over and voted, even though they weren't actually living in Kansas. There were people living there, but people that weren't just came over and voted. And if you're like, that's illegal, yeah, that was not okay, but they did it anyways. So here's the result. Who cares? Why does all that matter? Now Kansas has a super pro-slavery government. And people are like, wait, what? Like, people in Kansas are like, there's people who are pro-slavery here, but why are there this many pro-slavery representatives in our government? And there's all these new pro-slavery laws. This one is crazy. If you tried to help in Kansas, if you tried to help a slave run away, your punishment could be that you would be put to death. Crazy, right? So obviously, Kansas is going to be a little crazy, okay? This political cartoon is interesting. It says, forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. So, somebody who is, anti-slavery, and they're showing, these Southern men trying to force and say, hey, we know you didn't want slavery, but we went over and voted in your election, and we're forcing you to have it, so enjoy it, have it. It's kind of a disturbing cartoon. And then notice in the back, there's some buildings being burned on fire. We'll talk about that in a second. And there's also being somebody hanged in the background. Could be a slave. I'm not sure. Let's continue. So now we have a very pro-Kansas slavery government. Well, guess what? The other people in Kansas were like, we're not going to stand for this. We're making our own government, and it's anti-slavery. And of course, there's going to be conflict between the two. So one of the first things, in the May of 1856, there's this event called the Sack of Lawrence. Lawrence is a city in Kansas, where some people that were pro-slavery, that means they liked slavery, they're in a mob, and they just start attacking anti-slavery buildings and anti-slavery people. They set fires to houses. They stole things. They destroyed, there was a printing press for an anti-slavery newspaper that they destroyed, which that really cost a lot of money. And so guess what? People in Kansas, the anti-slavery people, are super upset. So how do they respond? Oh, and sorry, in that whole thing, we only know of one person who died, but the property damage and stuff like that, that was what was really bad. So in response, we find this guy, John Brown, and remember him because he's going to come back up later. So John Brown is against slavery. He hears about this Sack of Lawrence, and he's like, I don't like this. He's originally from New England area, Massachusetts area, but he's currently living in Kansas. And on May 24th, 1856, him and a bunch of other anti-slavery people, they round up 5 guys that they believe were part of that Sack of Lawrence, that are pro-slavery. And what do? They murder them. They kill them. Some of them, they kill them right in front of their families on their front yards. And they're like, yeah, we don't care. You attacked us first, and you like slavery anyways, so it's fine if we kill you. This event becomes known as the Potawatomi Massacre. Oh, here we go. I mentioned that they get beheaded with swords. So very violent, very bloody. And essentially now Kansas erupts into its own little mini war. Roughly in this time, 200 people are killed in Kansas, and it's just chaos between the anti-slavery and the pro-slavery people. And so we call like this time period Bleeding Kansas because so many people are dying and there's so much conflict. And here's a couple quotes from John Brown. He says, "Fight fire with fire," interesting, "and strike terror in the hearts of the pro-slavery people." Those are his goals. Okay. And let's take it political. So Congress also reacts in violence. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, he was like criticizing some of the pro-slavery people in Kansas, right? So he's like in our government, like in DC, and he's like, oh gosh, these pro-slavery people, they're the worst. And he personally insults this guy named Andrew Pickens Butler. He was a pro-slavery senator from South Carolina. And I mean, I'm not exactly sure the words he said, but it says he insulted him, so I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. Well, Andrew Pickens Butler doesn't respond like this. Instead, I believe it's his cousin is Preston Brooks, but basically a relative of him hears about this, and he also is he's involved in Congress as well. But anyways, he attacks Senator Charles Sumner with a cane, a walking cane, and beats him multiple times over and over again until Charles Sumner is unconscious and almost dead. And so Charles Sumner is immediately brought to like the hospital, and it takes him 3 years to recover from this injury. I can't believe he even did recover. It's really impressive. But how is like Preston Brooks and like, how is Andrew Pickens Butler? What about them? Like, are they in trouble? Actually, other Southern like senators start sending them canes in the mail to be like, yeah, we like what you did. And he's only fined $300 and say, oh, you're a bad boy. Pay $300. And that's it for beating a man almost to death. He just had to pay $300. So, here we go. Sorry, I was on your next slide. So I just like to point out this event because, like, it's one thing for some people in Kansas to go a little, okay, we're getting a little crazy. We're upset about slavery and our government. But, like, these people are, like, the people in our government. Like, these are our senators. These are our representatives. We vote for them to, like, work for us in the government and, like, vote on laws. And they have literally resorted to physical violence. So I like to point this out because, like, what do you think about that? Is this a sign of what is to come? People attacking each other in our Congress, right? Like nowadays, like, yeah, people might attack each other with their words, but do we see like senators like physically like fist fighting each other? I just think like that was a big sign. To me, that event was a big sign. The way it was handled and the event itself is like a sign of like, okay, here is what's going to come in our country. Here's a little foreshadowing. Here we go. This is like a novel being written, the Civil War novel. Foreshadowing is happening right here. So then we get to the Dred Scott decision. Prepare to be very disappointed in everything. Okay, so this guy over here on the left is named Dred Scott, and he was the slave of an army surgeon from Missouri. Scott, the slave, had traveled around with his owner from all over the country, and he spent actually a lot of time in the northern states living in free states. And after the army surgeon dies, he becomes the property of his widow, of like the army surgeon's widow. So he doesn't get his freedom. He's like in the will. It's like, my wife gets to own you now. And so now he's owned by another person. And Scott decides in 1846 to sue for his freedom. And he argues that he had spent so much time living in the free states that he should be a free person. So originally a lower court actually ruled in his favor, but then the Missouri Supreme Court ruled against it. And so 11 years go by, and finally it makes it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. So this is a big deal. This is a really important case. It's called Dred Scott versus Sanford. Oh, quick point. The majority of the Supreme Court justices are from the South. So maybe that will tell you about what is to come. So here are the 3 key issues that the Supreme Court has to address. number one, is Dred Scott a citizen? Because only citizens can sue in a federal court. Number two, did his time on the free soil actually make him free? Like, what makes a man free? And number three, does the Constitution allow states to ban slavery in parts of the Louisiana Purchase? Is the state allowed to ban slavery? Can that happen? Okay, so those are the three main things the Supreme Court has to think about. Those are some big issues. Again, prepare to be disappointed. Here's what they decide. Number one, here's the worst one. All African Americans, whether they are slave or free, are not citizens under the Constitution. I'm sorry. What? What? Oh my gosh, let's address this really quick. All African Americans living in the United States are not actually citizens of this country. Like, it doesn't matter that you live here, you are not a citizen of this country. It doesn't matter if you were born here. It doesn't matter if your great-great-grandfather fought in the Revolution and died for this country to start. Because you're African American, because of the color of your skin, you are not a citizen of this country. So even the free African Americans living in the North, right? They're born free. They've been free forever. They're actually not citizens either, according to the Supreme Court. Next, the federal government has no right to regulate slavery in federal territories acquired after the creation of the U.S. So the government doesn't have a right to say that a state is anti-slavery or slavery is not allowed in that state. Okay, so again, another ruling in favor of slavery. Ruling continued. The Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And they mention the Fifth Amendment, that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And since they are proposing that slaves are property, Congress could not prohibit someone from taking their property anywhere within the United States. And Congress cannot ban slavery in any territory. Okay, so they're literally citing, Fifth Amendment here to say, you can't be deprived of your life, liberty, or property, and your slave is your property. They are not a person. They are not a citizen of this country. You can do with them as you please. Interesting. So, does this Supreme Court ruling now solve the issue of slavery in the U.S.? Why or why not? That's a great question to think about. I'm going to let you choose to think about that and answer that on your own. You can pause and think about it if you want. And I will address this point. Just because something is doesn't mean that it's right. So, this was a ruling from our Supreme Court, and obviously it's really upsetting because it completely takes away all rights from African Americans, and it gives them nothing in our country. And it's so frustrating because it's not fair, right? For a person to be judged based off of the color of their skin. And, what if the Supreme Court ruled all white people are not citizens and they get to be owned by other people, right? Think about that. Our government being able to say, you are not actually a person, you're somebody's property, even though you are a person. So I like to bring this up because I think sometimes people, when a law is passed, they're like, okay, the law is passed. I just have to follow it, accept it, and go about my day. They know what's best. They're our government. They know what's best for us. And here's where that's wrong, right? Dred Scott. This decision is where it's just one example of something being wrong, right? We can still choose to follow the law, right? We should follow the law, but we don't have to accept it as it is. We can change the law. And obviously, this Supreme Court decision is eventually changed, right? Today, African Americans have equality. They have equal rights. They have the right to vote, men and women, and they are citizens of this country. So just because a law is in existence doesn't mean that it's right, doesn't mean that it can't be changed. So I encourage you to question laws, to question and say, just because this is, doesn't mean that it's right. Okay, don't just accept things as they are. Question them and possibly change them if it needs to be changed. Okay, we'll continue on. I'll stop preaching, but I think that's just a really important thing to go over there. Okay, so let's jump back. Lincoln-Douglas debate. Here we go. So after all this drama with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, bleeding Kansas, there is another new political party formed, and it's called the Republican Party, right? So now we finally see our two parties that we have today, the Democratic, Republican, those are our biggest political parties we have now. We've finally seen the two created, right? Andrew Jackson was our first Democratic president, and now we're seeing the creation of the Republican Party. And who is a part of this party? It's abolitionists, right? People who are against slavery. It's some Whigs, some Democrats, some Free Soilers. But these are all people, and their main thing that they're united in is that they are against slavery spreading. They don't want slavery to spread any further into our country. So in 1858, this guy over here on the right, who's looking very dashing, Abraham Lincoln, he runs under the Republican Party for a seat in the Senate in Illinois. And he's running against this guy named Stephen Douglas, who we've mentioned before. Think back to the railroad that we just talked about. And he has been a senator for 11 years. So Lincoln is running against somebody who's been in his position for a long time. So he's kind of going an uphill battle here. So Lincoln challenged Douglas in what became known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. These become really famous because, spoiler alert, Lincoln does not win this election. He does not become senator here. But these debates are what is the most important because it makes Lincoln become like a household name. People know him and people like the ideas that he proposes and the things that he says. Lincoln says, the spread of slavery is a major issue. Democrats want slavery to spread across the nation, and African Americans are entitled to all the natural rights in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, property, African Americans should have those rights. That's what Abraham Lincoln says. Douglas criticizes Lincoln for saying that the U.S. can't exist half slave, half free. He claims that Republicans wanted every state to be free and get rid of all slavery, which was not true, by the way. And he's saying all of this is going to lead to warfare. He's using these big scare tactics, right? Lincoln is going to lead us to war and he's going to take away all your slaves. But Douglas is actually against the Dred Scott ruling because he goes back to this idea of the people should be deciding on slavery, not necessarily the Supreme Court making a ruling on it. So like I said, I already got to that last bullet point. Douglas wins, but it doesn't matter because Lincoln is now known by many. So take it as this opportunity. You might lose something early on, right? In life, you might not make the team that you wanted to make. You might not get the job you wanted. You might, you're going to have obstacles that you hit and you might not get what you want. But Lincoln ultimately goes on to become a president, one of our most famous presidents and one of our most loved presidents of all time. And he loses this Senate race. So just remember, you have things that you're going to overcome. Just remember Lincoln, right? Think back to Lincoln. That's what I do anyways. Okay, I told you guys not to forget John Brown. So John Brown is back and he's better than ever and he's ready to start a slave uprising. What he wanted to do was attack the federal arsenal in Virginia, and he wanted to take all the weapons that were there. An arsenal is where you store weapons. He wanted to take all the weapons there. It's in this place called Harper's Ferry, by the way. That's the name of the place in Virginia. We wanted to take the weapons and give them to the local slaves and be like, we're just going to go around and kill slave owners, and we're going to take hostages, and we're going to just make a dent on this slavery issue and show people that we don't want slavery. So he tries to get people to raise money for him so he can have a small army. It doesn't go so well. So on October 16th, 1859, John Brown's raid begins. And him and his men, he does get some people to help him out. They take over that arsenal in Harper's Ferry, like I mentioned. They go around to some local plantations. They're like, come on, slaves, join us. And a lot of the slaves were like, no, I'm good. I know what happens if I get involved in something like this. And no offense, you don't seem very organized in your attack. So it was probably a really smart idea that these slaves did not get involved. So, though, as this is all going on, some local white people that are slave owners, they hear about this and they immediately start attacking John Brown. And in this attack, 8 of John Brown's men are killed. I believe 2 of them are his sons, actually, and they're older. They're not like little children. And 3 of the like local white people are killed as well. And so after the attack, Brown and his men retreat to this firehouse, and they're staged there, and they're like, oh, we got to keep fighting. We can't let this end. This is very dramatic, as you can tell from my story. Well, eventually, federal troops arrive. And who is part of these troops? Remember this name? Colonel Robert E. Lee. And he comes along and he's like, okay, okay, John Brown, surrender. Let's get through this thing. They ultimately storm the firehouse that John Brown is hiding in. I already mentioned that about the number of people killed. And guess what? This is the end of John Brown here. John Brown is captured. He's put on trial. He's convicted of treason, right? Treason is betraying your country. Because, technically, he was by stealing guns from our country and encouraging people to, kill people with them. So I guess it kind of makes sense, right? He's convicted of treason and murder and conspiracy, and he's ultimately sentenced to die. And he said, if I am dying for freedom, I could not die for a better cause. So he's hanged. That's the end of his life. Here's a quote from John Brown. He said, now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done. Bold statement. So if you're like, this was just like a little attack, some people died, okay. The biggest thing is the reaction to this, right? Many people in the North are going to mourn him and be like, it's sad that he died. But a lot of people are like, we wish he hadn't used so much violence because it's going to make the Southerners really mad. And guess what? The South is really mad. And they're like, we feel threatened. People use guns against us. They try to steal our guns. And they're trying to kill our slaves and free our slaves. And they're trying to kill us. And we don't like this. And Lincoln, right, he's not president. Lincoln's just around. He's like, yeah, listen, a lot of people care about what he says because he's been involved more in what's going on. And he's like, yeah, we agree that slavery is wrong. However, we should never be using violence and killing innocent people and committing treason against our country in order to stop this. This is a cartoon here of John Brown, kind of representing some things from his raid. It's very interesting if you get a chance to pause and take a look at some of the images that you see around here and see what you think. So, we're getting close to the end. Here we go. Stick with me. It's getting interesting. Trust me. I think it's already been interesting, but maybe you haven't been listening, but it's been pretty crazy. So, we get to presidential election of 1860. Northern Democrats elected our guy, Stephen Douglas. What? He's back again? Yes. Lincoln is facing him again, but don't worry. This time he's got it. And some other guys are elected as well from different political parties. I won't say them all because it's just gonna be confusing. But essentially, Lincoln is nominated by the Republican Party because he's seen as a moderate. So moderate means you're kind of in the middle. You're not super super conservative. You're not super liberal. Moderate is someone who's usually more in the middle. And he says slavery can stay in the South, but let's not let it expand so eventually die out. So this is seen as a more moderate view, right? Other people might say get rid of it completely. Other people might say keep slavery 100%. So Lincoln has a more moderate approach to it. So election day comes. Here's how the people vote. So the purple states are the states that Lincoln wins the majority in those states. right? Green states are this other, he's a Southern Democrat, Breckinridge. You see some other candidates as well. Like I said, I wasn't going to go over all of them. But as you see, Lincoln easily wins the electoral vote. And remember, that has to do with like winning the majority in certain states. If you win the majority, you win all the numbers for that state. And so some states have larger numbers because they have more people in that state. So Lincoln wins that. He also wins the popular vote. That means if you just looked at the numbers, just raw numbers, like who did you vote for? Lincoln won the most number of votes. So that doesn't really matter in our country. We only look at the electoral vote, but still, it's always more helpful if a candidate wins electoral and popular, because it just shows like, okay, people really did want this person to be president. But the thing is, as you saw, it wasn't like just completely more people vote for Lincoln. It's pretty divided. You already see this divide, right? Of northern states voting for Lincoln, southern states are like, no. So think about how the southern states are going to feel when Lincoln gets elected president, right? This is kind of a cartoon showing our nation being pulled apart by these different candidates. So I kind of already said this, right, that Lincoln didn't win the majority in the southern states, and this is going to make many Southerners angry because they're like, we didn't elect this guy. He doesn't represent us. He's not a Southerner, and he's made some comments about slavery that we're a little bit unsure about. And also Lincoln, he didn't even go to some of the southern states and campaign there. And so they're like, we don't even like know him. He didn't even like come down here. Like, we don't trust this guy. So I might have made it sound a little bit like less dramatic, but Southerners were like really upset about this election and really didn't think that Lincoln would like protect their views and understand like their values and their way of life. And so like within a week of the election, by the way, Lincoln hasn't even been sworn in as president. Remember, elections happen in November, president doesn't get sworn in until January. So November happens, he gets elected. A week later, he's still not president, but southern states decide to have a little meeting. And South Carolina is the one who's going to have this meeting. And they argue that southern states, since like back in the 13 colony days, we all like voluntarily agreed to join together and form like, you know, we agreed to fight together against the British and, you know, we agreed to form our country. But since that was voluntary, we could also leave whenever we want because it's just a voluntary agreement. We're the United States, it's just voluntary. That's what they claim. Other people disagree. The current president, right, who's not out of office yet, President Buchanan, said, no, like, it's not voluntary. Like, we all agreed to come together as, like, one country, and you can't just, like, dissolve that. And Lincoln says, listen, like, no state upon its own motion can lawfully get out of the Union. They can only do so against the law and by revolution. Uh-oh. So that's what South Carolina is going to do. So, and oh yeah, I forgot to say, I don't know if any of this sounds familiar to you. Let me read the sentence first. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina votes and decides to officially leave the United States. We say that they secede, which means to formally withdraw from the Union. Like the Union means the United States. So they vote to leave. Does this sound familiar? I already mentioned it once, but think back to Lincoln. Think back to Jackson. Think back to Andrew Jackson. Remember during his presidency, South Carolina threatened to leave back then? And I told you guys, like, be careful. Like, remember this. Remember South Carolina. Remember when they did this before. Here they are doing it again. And it's 1860. And again, Lincoln is not even in office yet. Guess what? A bunch of other states follow after. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, all also hold votes. And they're like, yep, we're joining South Carolina. We are leaving the United States. We don't want to be in a country where we didn't pick this president and he's going to try and get rid of our slaves. And so they decide to form a new country called the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. Okay, cool. So this little map is showing you here is our new country, if you can call it that, or here's kind of what's going on. Here's the deal, right? The blue is going to represent the U.S., the red is the Confederate States. This is showing you eventually all the Confederate States. At this point, not all of them have left, but at this point, but eventually this is how many will leave. Like all these red ones are all the southern states that will formally leave the Union. The border states are another thing that I will talk about once we get to the Civil War. So this new country, the Confederacy, they decide to create a new constitution, and in their constitution they say every citizen of our country has the right to own slaves. Cool. Not cool, obviously, but great. That's what you're going to found your country on, is slavery. They elect this guy, Jefferson Davis, president. He really didn't want to be president, but he's like, I've got no choice. The people are picking me. Obviously, we're going to see a lot of issues here, right? Is this allowed? Can these states just do this, right? Could California just be like, we're going to leave and form our own country? Like, is that allowed? Great question. That's what this is going to bring up, is like, can these states actually do this? Let's figure it out. One of the big issues is like, what about all the land in the South that belongs to the United States government? So think of like forts that have weapons that are created and produced by our government and that we own. Does the South now just get to claim that that's their weapons? Because it actually belongs to like the U.S. government. So that's just one issue that's going to pop up right away. So I believe this is our last one here. So once Lincoln is finally inaugurated, right, he's giving his official address, being sworn as president. His address is actually in March, which is interesting. That's a whole other story. But in March, he gives his inaugural address, and he says the government receives power from the consent of the governed. This country belongs to the people. If they have a problem, they can fix things by making amendments, by proposing changes to our government, just like we've already done multiple times in our country. We've made amendments, we've made changes. And he's saying, if you have a problem, amend the government. Don't just choose to leave and give up, right? So he tries to convince Southerners, like, I'm not going to provoke war. We're going to figure this out, and eventually he believes the South will return over time, and that this is just a little blip, a little like conflict, a little like, we're going to work this out, and as president, I'm going to try and work this out. This is really cool. This is a picture up here. This is actually the picture of President Lincoln's inauguration, and if you notice how the building looks a little bit messed up, that's because the Capitol building was still being rebuilt, because remember back in the War of 1812, the British burned it down. So it's 1860, well now 1861, and it's still being rebuilt. It hasn't been finished being built yet, but I always just find that really interesting. But yeah, Lincoln's over here on this stage. You can't see him very well, but this is an actual picture from his inauguration. I thought it was pretty cool. So that's where we're left. We see all these different conflicts, like the Missouri Compromise failing, the Compromise of 1850 failing. We have this new proposal, all these proposals about dealing with slavery. We see the Dred Scott decision, battles politically, growing differences between the North and South, conflict in Kansas, debates between Lincoln and another candidate, and ultimately this is going to lead to civil war. There will be some specific events that we'll get to, but we'll get to that and when we get to our Civil War notes. So this little video is linked in your notes. So I would highly suggest you check this out because it's really helpful in understanding some of the things that we talked about today. So again, sorry those notes are a little bit long, but this was a really important topic, and I hope you learned a little bit more about how our country is going to be brought to the edge of civil war. And this is again leading right up to the big event that's going to kick off the Civil War, which we'll talk about next time. So thanks for sticking with me.